Welcome to the Art Colony, a podcast about art and art history in Provincetown. My name is Gaston Lacombe. You've heard her name on this podcast countless times already. When we have talked about the great visual artists who have worked in Provincetown, her name always comes up. In fact, she is also often the only woman that is mentioned. I am talking, of course, about the painter Helen Frankenthaler. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, she was a regular presence here in Provincetown and created a lot of her work here. In 2018, the Provincetown Art Association and Museum held a large retrospective of her work, helping more Provincetown residents and visitors get better acquainted with this painter who completely transformed visual arts in the 20th century. And today we're also going to get to know her better on this podcast and talk about Helen Frankenthaler's connection with Provincetown. And joining me for this discussion is Elizabeth Smith, Executive Director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, how are you? Happy to be here.
I am very happy to have you over. I've been wanting to have a discussion about Helen Frankenthaler for a long time. So when I start the podcast, usually, I always start with the same question. I ask, who is? And in this case, it's going to be two questions. So first of all, who is Elizabeth Smith?
I'm Elizabeth Smith, the Executive Director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, and I've been doing this work for 13 years. I was the founding Executive Director of the foundation, which came into existence after Frankenthaler passed away. Previously, before joining the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, I was a curator, and I worked in several museums in the US and in Canada during the course of my career. So it was something of a shift to switch over to the foundation world, but it's been a great pleasure and joy to delve deeply into the life and work of Helen Frankenthaler.
That's great. Did you know her personally?
I never met her. So I knew her only, through reputation, and I knew something of her work, but I wasn't steeped in it by any means at the time when I came on to direct the foundation.
And tell us more about the foundation. What is the main goal of the foundation? What was the foundation established for?
Well, Frankenthaler herself set up the foundation back in the 1980s, and the idea was that it would become active after her death. So she left the majority of her assets to the foundation, her artworks, archives and papers, copyright and intellectual property, her financial assets. And the primary mission of the foundation is to encourage understanding and appreciation of the visual arts. So we do that using the tangible and intangible assets of Helen Frankenthaler to pursue that mission.
Wonderful. And for some of our listeners, it might not be a name that they're familiar with. So we'll have to also ask, who was Helen Frankenthaler?
Well, Helen Frankenthaler is considered one of the great artists of the second half of the 20th century. She came to maturity out of the abstract expressionist movement. She was most directly influenced and impacted by the artists of the first generation of ABEX. Frankenthaler went on to establish a career as an active artist for a period of over 60 years. And during that time, she continued to innovate and experiment with the language of abstraction, not just in painting, but also in printmaking. She became very well known as well as an experimental and innovative printmaker. So she remains one of the giants of abstract art in the second half of the 20th century.
So if we're going to talk about the history of Helen Frankenthaler, let's start at the very beginning. What's her origin? Where was she born? Where do we find her at the beginning of her life?
She was born in 1928 in New York City. And she was, really a dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker, lived there for much of her life. Her father was a justice of the New York State Supreme Court, and her mother was a homemaker. She was the youngest of three daughters, and they lived on the Upper East Side. They had a comfortable and fairly privileged life. And she was raised, going to the museums in New York City, going to the other cultural attractions, really taking advantage of the city. And her family encouraged her creative sensibility and her artistic nature.
Were there any important events early in her life that led her towards the path of being an artist?
Well, I think there were quite a few. She, as an adult, told some wonderful stories about how she would, sort of play with certain aspects of art making as a young child. For instance, she took her mother's red nail polish and would let it drop into a sink full of water and enjoyed watching the sort of the constellations made by the nail polish in the water. Or she would draw a line with chalk for a very great distance down the sidewalk of a New York City street. So these kinds of quirky behaviors really present a creative and experimental and artistic sensibility. Her family encouraged her a great deal, and they really exposed her to art, to creativity. And as she was the youngest as well, she was indulged by the family in that regard. I should say also that something quite traumatic that happened to her during her childhood was that her father, with whom she was very close, passed away when she was only age 11. So this was quite a serious trauma for her as a young child.
So, for those of us who know Helen Frankenthaler's work, that story about dripping nail polish in water is actually quite evocative of her work as she became a mature artist. Is she someone who went to art school, or is she mostly self-made as an artist?
She definitely went to art school. In fact, she started studying art in high school, which is somewhat unusual, especially because her teacher during her senior year of high school was Rufino Tamayo, who later became a well-known artist as a Mexican muralist, but at the time he was teaching high school art in New York City. She went on after that to Bennington College in Vermont. And there she thought about, but she ended up gravitating toward painting. And she studied there with the artist Paul Feeley, who also would go on to become a much better known artist than he was at the time when he was teaching back in the late 1940s. So with Feely, she really honed the knowledge and the skills she gained, which was to study modern art and cubism. So at Bennington, she really became well versed in what it meant to make a cubist and modern inflected painting.
And that's what she started with. Her art was, from the beginning, influenced by the modern influences of the early 20th century.
That's right, very much so, and especially Cubism, and that attention to Cubism that she absorbed early on continues to show up in her work over the years in terms of her interest in space, creating space on a flat surface.
Now, one marking event in her young life is her introduction to Hans Hofmann, who's one of Provincetown's giants. So, can you tell us more about how they became connected?
After she graduated from college, she began a friendship and a relationship with the critic Clement Greenberg, who was a giant of criticism at the time. And he encouraged her to come to Provincetown to study with Hans Hofmann. He thought it would be an experience that she would gain a great deal from. And of course, so many other artists interested in modern painting were doing that at the time. So Helen went in 1950. This is a year after she graduated from Bennington. And she only stayed 3 weeks, which was a short haul, in part because she felt that she already knew a lot about the things he was teaching. And we can look back at that, and it sounds a little bit arrogant, perhaps, for this young woman to have that sense of the study. But I think she also really was, very well versed in modern painting. She had learned a lot already, and she was, quite a talented individual. So after 3 weeks, she moved on. She left Provincetown, and she didn't, go back until much later.
So, she was not part of his school in New York.
She was not. No,
So, she only came
no.
to Provincetown and met him here. In
She
the
only,
book Ninth Street Women, when we talk about Helen Frankenthaler, she seems to imply, I forget the name of the author now, she seems to imply that they had a close relationship, or that Hoffman had great admiration for Frankenthaler early on.
yes, I think that is true. She and he remained friends over the years. So her short stint with studying with him in 1950 laid the groundwork for a friendship that would continue over the years, especially when she came back to Provincetown a number of years later, and then they saw each other much more regularly as friends and colleagues.
So, all through the 50s, then, she only came to Provincetown once. Is that right?
Well, she is known to have visited there briefly a couple of times, but nothing of any length or substance. So it wasn't until she returned after her marriage to Robert Motherwell, who had been a long time um, resident of Provincetown, that she really became a force there. That it really became a place where she would return to year after year.
So when we think about her first trip to Provincetown, what sort of art did she create there? And I'm thinking, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking I was at the Portland Art Museum in Oregon a couple of years ago, and there was an early painting by Frankenthaler called Provincetown. Is that the sort of work she was creating then?
Are you referring to that initial period
Yes.
of 1950
Yeah.
when she was with Hoffman? Well, yes. I mean, she created a variety of things during her short stay during that early summer. She, like all of the other students, did the abstracted figurative drawings that Hoffman encouraged all of his students to make. So there are some of those that she made, but she also took inspiration from the bayfront, the contours of the town, the beach, and she made some small but very interesting early works of art using those places and spaces as points of reference. And they were quasi abstracted. So you can see her sort of continuing to come into her own and to find her own vocabulary as an abstract artist.
So you say then her, triumphal return to Provincetown was in, sorry, that's a strange expression, but in the early 60s when she came back with Robert Motherwell. What was the date exactly?
Well,
59,
they
60?
well, in 1959, she and Motherwell actually rented a house in Falmouth. They weren't like staying in Provincetown. But then as of 1960, they spent most or part of every summer during that decade in Provincetown. There was only one year, which was 1965, when they spent a large part of the summer traveling in Europe. And this was following the death of their close friend, David Smith, the sculptor. So they did the grand tour of Europe that year with Motherwell's daughters, Lise and Jeannie. So it was a different kind of summer. But otherwise, during most of the '60s, they were there. She and Motherwell were there, and really was a tremendous place for both of them, and especially for Helen. She wasn't quite sure about Provincetown initially, apparently. There's a letter in our archives where she wrote to a friend and said, and I think this was in 1960, she said something like, I haven't been so sure about Provincetown, but I'm finding that I quite like it much more than I thought I would, much more than I expected to.
Do you know what she was expecting?
Well, I honestly, I'm not quite sure, but I think she may have been concerned that it was sort of a more provincial enclave than she was used to. She had been going out during the 50s, during much of the 50s, to the Hamptons quite often. And so she was part of that scene here and there. And it's a very different scene from Provincetown.
And yeah, that's one interesting thing about Provincetown. We've had this historic link with New York. In the summer, we have a lot of the New York members of the art circles, literary and visual arts, coming to Provincetown, and that's still going on now. So when she was here, this was for the whole summer from May to September.
It varied.
Hmm.
So sometimes, it would be June or like 4th of July until August or, into September. Sometimes they had to stay a little later because they were doing something on their house here, there.
Yeah.
So it varied. It wasn't always exactly the same number of days. And Motherwell always welcomed the chance to be there for an extended period of time.
And do you know approximately what the life was like for them here? Was she here following the same sort of rhythm she was in New York, studio life, home life, or was it more relaxed when she was here, working less? What was her rhythm of life here like?
The rhythm was quite different from her time in New York, and that was part of the beauty and the pleasure of it. She was very committed to painting. So every day, almost every day, sometimes she didn't, but her pattern was to work in her studio in the mornings. So from, let's say, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then there was lunch. And then in the afternoons, swimming, going out on the boat, relaxing, and then perhaps, having dinner with guests, visitors, or just having family time. Because it was a beautiful time for Helen Frankenthaler and her husband to just be there without the kind of distractions that they experienced in New York. So they were both dedicated to getting their work done for part of the day and being able to do so sort of free of a lot of distractions, but then also spending time enjoying the pleasures of the place.
And their house was right by the water. It was in what I call the extreme east end of town. I think it's in the 500s. It's way up,
That's right.
maybe even in the 600s. In the
Yeah.
600s, yeah.
Yes.
And it was right on the water.
That's right.
Where did she have her working studio?
So she had three different studios. The first one, when they got there in 1960, was at the Days Lumber Yard. She and Motherwell each had studios in the same building. And then when they got the house done on Commercial Street that they called the Seed Barn, they each had studios there. So they, were able to live and work in the same environment. Both of their studios looked right out onto the water. So it was tremendous, vista and access to swimming, which Helen loved to do very much. And then in 1967, she moved her studio out of that house and she got a place that was right near the Nelson riding stables. And she referred to that studio colloquially as the studio in the woods, or the treehouse studio.
Mm-hmm.
So she made work in those three places during her Provincetown years.
And going back to the Days Lumberyard Studios, we've talked about that on the podcast when we talked with the director of the Fine Arts Work Center. We talked about the fact that it was a lumberyard first, and then it became the Fine Arts Work Center. And I often go to the Fine Arts Work Center. I do some work there as well. And people still today talk about the fact that in that barn, Helen Frankenthaler had a studio.
Yeah, I mean, the history of artists who have practiced there, I'm sure, is like very impressive over the years.
Yeah, when I usually do a residency every year in May at the Fine Arts Work Center for a week. And there's always a rotation of other residents that come in and out at that time. And whoever is working or staying in that space is always bragging about the fact that I have the Helen Frankenthaler space. So what kind of work was she creating then in the 1960s when she was here?
1960 was a pretty pivotal year for her. She had just had a survey exhibition of a decade of her previous work in New York at the Jewish Museum. So I think for any artist, having an exhibition like that sort of summarizes an aspect of your practice is cause for reflection and for possibly, turning your work in new directions. And she indeed was doing that around 1960. Her painting around that time started to change and it became more simplified, more reductive. The colors became a bit brighter and more primary. And she played quite a good deal more with geometry and she started to play with symmetry. So she was really making some significant changes in her work, which in the prior decade had been much more gestural and expressionistic, much more, filled with brushy gestures. Of course, remember that she was always working, or from 1952 onward, she was always working on the floor with thinned down paint that she would then pour onto the surface of the canvas. And then
I want to talk more about that. Tell me more about that technique, because that's really what she is associated with nowadays. Do we call it pouring? What would be? I mean, if some of our listeners have not seen her work before, how would you describe the essence of her work at that time and the technique?
So the technique has become known as the soak stain
The
technique.
soak stain, not the pouring. Soak stain. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yes, right. Which really gives you an idea of how it was practiced. This kind of soaking into the surface of the canvas and then a staining of the canvas with the pigment that was thin enough to be moved around easily. But Frankenthaler didn't just, pour paint on and let it go wherever it may. She was very rigorous in manipulating and moving the paint around the surface of the canvases to create the kind of compositions that she desired. and they were extremely varied. She was able to perfect this technique and become a real master of it so that over the years, and just thinking about the 60s, which we're talking about now, she was able to create many, many, many different effects using this technique.
And she was working on raw canvas, which is unusual for painters. Because I'm a painter myself, usually we always put a layer of what we call gesso on the canvas, which is sort of a chalky white substance that really grips onto the paint, or the paint grips onto the gesso, sorry. But she was working on completely unprimed raw canvas, right?
For the most part,
Mm-hmm.
she did on occasion prime her canvases.
Okay.
She was an experimenter. She didn't do anything exactly the same way. She always varied things up. But for the most part, yes.
When you use a canvas that's unprimed like this, what does it do to the paint? What does it do to the colors?
Well, the colors are able to, or the pigment is able to really move and to seep in to the canvas. When she was using oil paint, the halos from the oil paint were quite evident. But then in the early 60s, she switched over to acrylic paint, which has different properties. And with acrylic, the halos, weren't quite as evident, and the paint dries faster, and it just has a different kind of viscosity. So when she started working with acrylic, she stuck with acrylic for a long time.
And these halos were caused by turpentine, right? That she was diluting the paint with?
Yes, yes. Yeah,
And
that oily sense.
and I read that because turpentine is a caustic material, this can lead in the long term to deterioration of these canvases. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Is that something the foundation works with to preserve these canvases that might be affected by these materials?
We've seen very little evidence of
Okay,
deterioration
good.
in our paintings, I am happy to say. So, of course, we keep our eyes on work, and we have great conservators that we consult when needed. But she seems to have created a body of work that has remained in very good shape over the years. But she was an experimenter, and what she was trying to do was to produce the visual and formal effects that she felt could best realize her vision. And, she was so interested in this idea of ambiguity in painting. She took a lot of inspiration from landscape, uh, certainly when she was in Provincetown, the presence of the water, the presence of the light, the colors in the sky, even the forms of some of the areas of the town, all sort of factored into her sensibility. The forms of the breakwaters, uh, things like that. And she was able to convey the essence of these forms using this highly abstracted technique in a way that really I think is quite distinctive from how many other artists have done so.
Oh, absolutely. You can tell right away that this is a Helen Frankenthaler work, especially compared to other Abex painters. She has a very, very distinctive style.
Yes, I agree with you. And I also, at the same time, see that the work she made at one time in her life compared to work she made, 30 years later looks very different. But yet there are these points of commonality. And I do think that one constant throughout her work was her interest in and her passion for space, creating like spatial effects and big and ambiguity on a canvas, the presence of light as a way to activate an abstract painting so that it wasn't flat and dull or dead, but that it had movement and drama and dynamism in it. And she took a lot of inspiration from the weather. And when you think about, the storms or rain clouds or the light, sunset, sunrise, the water, that she observed in Provincetown, all of this made a very big impact on her and how she chose to make an abstract painting.
Is her body of work from the 1960s in Provincetown a very large body of work? Is this something that's a big chunk of her general oeuvre, or is that just a few paintings?
Well, she painted quite a number of works there. And we have documentation of much of the work that she painted at the time. And just to give you one example, she wrote to a friend saying, at the end of the summer, oh, I've, packed up packed up all the paintings to send them back to New York. I made about 15 to 17, good paintings this summer. So, that's a fair amount.
And those tend to be very large.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, those would be large ones.
And are these, do you have a lot of these paintings in your foundation's collection?
We do, because Helen Frankenthaler kept a lot of her own work. So that passed to the foundation after her estate was settled. And we are fortunate to be able to lend works to exhibitions. We lent a number of the pieces that were in the Abstract Climate Show at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum back in 2018. We lend to exhibitions all over the world.
Well, I was looking at your Instagram account this morning, and I saw that currently, as we're recording this, you have an exhibit at the Gogosian Gallery in New York, and you have also one in Basel in Switzerland. And in both these exhibits, there are paintings that are called Provincetown.
That's right. Absolutely. Yes. There is a fabulous painting in the Gagosian exhibition right now, which sadly closes in a couple of days, called Provincetown 1. It's just an extraordinary painting where she made a very rigorous and reductive painting, but one that is also filled with gesture and mark making and really wonderful elements of paint. But it's structured sort of as a square within which some of the marks and gestures are positioned.
So it's wonderful that, she is able to carry the name of Provincetown still now on a global scale.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And she often did title pieces that she made after places she had been. For instance, she spent time in Europe, and there's another painting in the show that's now at Gagosian called Alassio. And that, of course, is titled after the Italian town of Alassio, where she spent some time with Robert Motherwell early in their marriage. Santa Fe was also a place of inspiration for her. She visited in the 70s. But it was really Provincetown with its sustained presence for her over the period of most of the decade that had a really strong and significant impact on her work.
So in Provincetown, when she was here, who was with her? Did she have friends that she was hanging out with, other artists that we might know?
There were quite a number of people who visited Helen and Bob in Provincetown. They often had people come down from New York and spend time with them, and they cherished the presence of their friends as guests and visitors. And some of the people that came to spend time with them there included David Smith, the sculptor, the curator Henry Geldzaler, who was curator at the Metropolitan Museum. He came on several occasions over the course of the decade. The writer and art historian Barbara Rose, who wrote a book about Helen Frankenthaler. The poet Frank O'Hara came for a visit in the 60s. The director of the Whitechapel Gallery in London, Brian Robertson, who became a close friend of theirs, her dealers would come. Andre Emmerich from New York, some other dealers she had in Los Angeles and in Toronto. So there was there were quite a number of people who would come and spend time with them. They enjoyed that very much. And then, of course, people who also had places in Provincetown, they were friends and people they socialized with. And some of those include the critic and collector B.H. Friedman and his wife, the poet Stanley Kunitz and his wife, the painter Elise Asher, and a number of the other artists who spent time there in the summer. And of course, we mentioned Hofmann already.
Mm-hmm.
He had become a friend. And, there are great photos of Helen and Bob sitting on their deck with Hans Hofmann and other visitors and the children. And it's really, really quite wonderful.
And I think I read somewhere in passing something about Motherwell, Frankenthaler, and the Rothkos, because the Rothkos also had a house here in Provincetown.
Yes, that's right.
When she was here in Provincetown, was she one of those people that would get involved in the community and participate in teaching classes and joining organizations, or was she mostly just there to work in her studio?
She was mostly there to work in her studio and spend time with family and friends and enjoy the pleasures of Provincetown. She wasn't much of a one to be engaged with the community. She did exhibit, a couple of times. I think I mentioned already. She participated in the art association shows on a couple of occasions, but otherwise it was more of a time spent with family and friends in a place that she loved.
How did this come to an end?
Her last summer spent in Provincetown was 1969. And then after that, a year or two later, she and Motherwell divorced. And then she didn't come back for many years. She did return for a visit in the 90s, I know, to her stepdaughter, Lise Motherwell, who's been a longtime summer resident in Provincetown. But during that time after she and Motherwell divorced and until a couple decades later, she stayed away. She did have a place in Connecticut by the water that that she had as a studio, and then she also had a waterfront home. So I really feel that her experience in Provincetown of being right by the water and having such proximity to water made such a big impression on her, and it was something that she wanted. She wanted to keep that in her life.
Hmm.
So the Connecticut shore offered that opportunity for her. The whole Provincetown chapter of her life and work hadn't really been examined until the exhibition happened that took place at the Art Association and Museum. And I was so fortunate to be able to work with Lise Motherwell. We worked together on an exhibition that would identify a number of the pieces that she had made in Provincetown and do some, research and scholarship to produce a catalog that included essays not just by us, but by some other art historians and experts on the matter. And we feel that we made quite a good contribution to widening the understanding of Helen's life and work and pointing out or pointing to how significant this chapter was in her life and what a lasting impact it had on her work.
It's an exhibit people still talk about. I was there in 2018. I was here. I mean, in 2018, I saw the show, and it's an exhibit that still comes up in conversation on a regular basis because it was extremely impactful. You had very large pieces in there, so these were paintings you could almost walk into. It was not just small things that you admired on the wall. It was really an immersive experience.
That's right. I'm delighted to hear that people are still talking about it. It makes me very happy.
Do you think that, well, you already mentioned that, she was in Connecticut by the water afterwards, but do you think that there's other ways that Provincetown stayed with her for the rest of her life?
I would say it did, not in an overt way, but I think that her experience there helped shape her practice in terms of its relationship to landscape and seascape, if, to use those more conventional terms. The reason why we titled our show Abstract Climates is because it came from a direct quote from her where she talks about her work being about climates, abstract climates, and not nature per se, but a feeling associated with nature. I think she really honed that when she was living and working in Provincetown, and that stayed with her. That continued to shape a lot of how she approached her paintings that were inspired by landscape and climate and the weather, not in any kind of overt way, but in this sort of very atmospheric, moody way that could suggest different sort of states of interior landscape as well as exterior. So I feel that that could be a way in which Provincetown stayed with her, aside from the importance of the water.
So Helen Frankenthaler passed away in 2011, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Looking at her whole body of work and her whole life, how would you place her in the history of art and in the history of American art?
Well, we consider her now as one of the second generation abstract expressionists because that's where she was rooted, but someone whose painting practice really transcends movement designations because she did maintain a body of work for, a 60-year career, and she continued to develop her language of abstract painting. So she wasn't always working in that ab-ex inflected gestural vocabulary, yet that was part of the basis of how her work developed over time. She can be considered a giant of late 20th century painting, in part because she came to develop a significant reputation early in her life when she was still, a very young artist. She achieved some significant acclaim and major exhibitions quite early on. She sustained her reputation as an important painter, a major painter throughout her whole career. And sadly, not too many other women artists of her generation were able to maintain that reputation at that high level.
There's this fantastic book that I mentioned already, Ninth Street Women, that talks about five of these women who made their mark on the second half of the 20th century, including Helen Frankenthaler. It's a really highly recommended read.
That's right. It's an excellent book. And in fact, it was the writer of that book, Mary Gabriel, was the first researcher that we welcomed at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation shortly after we became active. And we really weren't at that stage yet ready to welcome visitors, but we knew her project sounded really important, so we were happy to invite her in to look at our archival materials.
Well, that's great because she did a great job. Now, when it comes to painters that work more abstractly, sometimes viewers have trouble connecting with the work. Viewers have trouble understanding how to approach this work. So if one of our listeners goes to a museum or an exhibit and there's one of those gigantic Helen Frankenthaler paintings on the wall, how should they approach it? What sort of mindset should they have when they approach her work?
I think that's an excellent question. And with Helen Frankenthaler's work, I think one really important way to approach it is by getting up close. Her paintings reward close looking. On the surface or at first glance, they might appear to be, all one color. And so someone might, decide to dismiss looking closely at the work. But if you do get up and really study it, you will see all kinds of variety within that one color, let's say, if it's a work of that kind. You will see gradations and variations of lightness and darkness, thicker areas and thinner areas. You will see all kinds of small gestures and marks and movements that are evident on the surface of the canvas. And you can get like really sort of lost in these things if you give a work careful attention. But then if you step back, you get a large effect. And so the spatiality of her work, I think, is really, really important because she spent a lot of time really trying to create a work that would have that kind of visual interest and movement in it. For me, some of the paintings that are my favorites are the ones that almost feel like they're breathing in front of me, where you see so much luminosity and light and changes and shifts in the source of light or the thinness to thickness that it almost feels like the painting is animate. And I would encourage people to, as I said, look closely and then step away. The show at Gagosian right now was titled in an interesting way that speaks to this point. The title is The Moment and the Distance. And that phrase comes from a passage in the writing of Barbara Guest, poet, who was a friend of Helen Frankenthaler's. And actually, she used that passage in writing a piece about Helen Frankenthaler's work. And what she meant by that was precisely what I'm talking about. The distance of sort of stepping back and taking in a large painting, as well as the moment that you can discern by observing closely, is something that really makes these works come alive.
Now, I have listeners on this podcast globally. I'm always surprised to look at my statistics and see listeners in Asia, listeners in Europe, listeners everywhere. And this show will come out in the middle of July. So if our listeners, wherever they are, want to experience Helen Frankenthaler's work, are there exhibits coming up? Or are there specific places you'd send them to?
Well, let's see. And if they can make it to Europe by the middle of August, they could go and see the really wonderful exhibition that's at the Kunstmuseum in Basel, which is a beautiful exhibition surveying the career of Helen Frankenthaler, presenting paintings over many decades, and also examining how her work took inspiration from art history. We haven't talked about that at all in this
Yeah.
podcast because, in Provincetown was so much about the place and the space and the landscape and the light. But art history was also an important source of inspiration for her. There are other exhibitions planned in coming years, and we're very happy to say that there will be a few taking place around the US and in Europe over the next 2 to 3 years, including during Frankenthaler's centennial year in 1928. So we're very excited that the National Gallery in Washington is going to be organizing a major retrospective of her work that will open in early 2028, and it will travel to two other museums in the US and one in Europe.
Well, that's
So
fantastic. I look
listeners,
forward to
stay
it.
tuned.
I go to DC at least once a year. I really look forward to it because I was in New York this winter and there was an exhibit at the MoMA of her work, but I got there on the day of one of the big snowstorms. And when I got to the museum, I could see the paintings from far away, but they wouldn't let people in because they didn't have enough staff that day. I was so angry, but but I could see Helen Frankenthaler's paintings from far away. So that's great. National Gallery 2028. Put that on your calendar. That will be definitely an exhibit to see.
Yes, we're very excited about it. And other things are in the works as well, other types of exhibitions, including a major survey of her works on paper, which will take place at a New York institution next year. I'm not sure they've announced it yet, so I don't know if I should say yet, but soon, word will be out about that. There are also a number of university museums around the US that present works by Helen Frankenthaler in the medium of printmaking, because our foundation has had a program for a number of years to make gifts of Helen Frankenthaler's prints to university museums where they can be used for, any educational and artistic purposes that are, germane to those institutions. And many of them choose to present exhibitions. So, for instance, the Gray Art Museum at NYU is going to be presenting a show of our gifts of prints by Helen Frankenthaler opening in September here in New York City.
Were her prints very different from her paintings?
Yes and no. They share certain visual commonalities. In some cases, you can see really direct and clear relationships between the paintings and the prints. But the mediums that she used in her printmaking practice were, of course, so different. She used every type of printmaking practice you can imagine. And in fact, she would often combine different techniques in the same work. And she would make woodcuts that were increasingly elaborate in terms of the number of blocks and the number of colors, and really is kind of mind boggling. So it was a different approach to art making that she deployed in her printmaking. And of course, that's also a collaborative practice. You have to work with other people. And
Hmm.
she developed great relationships with master printers and people that helped her realize her intentions in printmaking. Whereas in her painting practice, she was, the solitary artist in the studio. And it was a very different way of working, but she loved both.
I have to look that up. I'm actually not very familiar with her prints, so I'll have to look that up. I loved making a lot of prints as well, so maybe I'll get inspiration from that. Welcome back. Remember to follow us on Instagram at The Art Colony Podcast, where you can find out all about what's coming up in a podcast. And also, if you want to help us out, you can go to buymeacoffee.com, look for The Art Colony Podcast, and you can leave us a little tip to help us stay on the air. And thank you to all those who have donated already. Elizabeth, before I let you go, I saw something extremely interesting on your Instagram account because the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation has an Instagram account, a very active one, and that was the Helen Frankenthaler Climate Initiative Grants. Can you tell us more about that?
I'd love to. It's become a signature program for our foundation. About 6 years ago, we decided to test the waters, as it were, and see what we could do to help arts institutions, primarily museums, but also any other kinds of presenting visual arts institutions, become more energy efficient. How could we help them reduce their climate footprint, save money on energy expenses, and in general, just be more sustainable, become more green? So we launched a pilot program 6 years ago to see how we could do that. And it's become extremely successful because what we found was there were no other private foundation funders in the art museum space doing this. And for museums and arts organizations, usually energy costs are the second highest aspect of their budgets. second only after, staffing, personnel and benefits and things like that. Then there's the cost of energy. So we felt that if we could, provide some funds to organizations to help take steps to reduce their energy usage, we could help them save money that could be used towards their artistic missions. 6 years later, we have funded many, many organizations. I think possibly over 400 at this point
Well,
around the United States.
401.
401. Okay,
That's
I
what
was
the
close.
Instagram said, 401. Yeah.
Yes. So we're very proud of that because we've seen how the need has been increasing as our program has become more known. We are receiving more and more applications. And we're able to provide funding at different levels depending on what the museum needs to do. And that enables them, usually sometimes it's, not more than seed money, but just having that seed money can often help catalyze other funding. And, we feel this is, one of the most important issues of our time. It's something Helen Frankenthaler might never in her wildest dreams have imagined or thought about. But, sometimes when we think about the climate initiative, we come back to that statement by Helen about, her work being about abstract climates, not nature per se, but feeling associated with nature. And we know that nature and the climate were important to her.
Hmm.
But she would have been dismayed by, what so many of us have seen happen with climate change. So we're delighted to carry this program forward in her name, and we've made a very positive impact on 401 organizations and counting.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And the way you were describing her work earlier, um, I was already seeing in your description a lot of themes and ideas that link directly with preserving our planet, climate change, and all the initiatives that are part of this program. So, congratulations on that. That's really fantastic. Do you know if you have any Provincetown organizations that have applied?
Well, yes, actually, we have given grants to. I don't want to name names as I don't want to get it wrong and
Hmm.
misspeak. But yes, we have had applications and we have given grants to Provincetown organizations through our climate initiative.
Well, good. If any of you are listening, well, look it up because you can apply to participate in this program. You should really apply. Now, before I let you go, I just wanted to know, is the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation open to the public, either for visits or for researchers? If anybody wants to have access to your materials, is that possible?
We are open for research. And in fact, we have researchers here almost every day now. We have a great treasure trove of archival materials that Helen Frankenthaler kept. So increasingly, people are coming to us to do research. We are not, otherwise, we're not really open to the public. We do welcome, we have welcomed groups. Just today we have a group of interns from a New York City museum coming to the foundation to talk with our staff and hear about what we do. So we do welcome, specialized groups for conversations or for special programs. We have a handful of artworks on the walls of our study center, but we don't really have like a proper, viewing place here. A couple times we've had a knock at the door and there have been people from, like, say, Germany, we're like, oh, we noted the foundation is here. Can we come in and visit? And, we have to say, I'm sorry, we're not, a public space really. But we're delighted that people want to seek us out. And as I said, for, research options, we're the place to come.
And if people want to find out more about your organization, where should they go?
They should go to our website, Helen Frankenthaler Foundation website. You can easily find that online. Our Instagram account, as you mentioned, is also quite active, and we give quite a lot of notice about various exhibitions, funding initiatives, and matters of other interest.
And yeah, for the digital generation, I found the Instagram account to be a great place to also browse through Helen Frankenthaler's work and get an idea of the paintings and of the other work that she's created. It's really easy as you sit there and scroll through your phone, just scroll through the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation Instagram account, and you'll find out a lot more about her work, what it looks like, what it represents. Well, this has been a great conversation. I'm so happy we finally got Helen Frankenthaler on the Art Colony podcast. Thank you very much for joining me, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And I want to thank, as we're still on air, I want to thank Leslie Marchessault from the Commons in Provincetown and also Chris McCarthy from the Provincetown Art Association Museum for connecting me with Elizabeth. Thank you so much to both of you for helping me with that. So have a great day, and thank you for joining us.